If you've ever tripped and fell through a doorway during mount training and butt stroked yourself with your own rifle, hit that subscribe button. If you've ever hunted, tripped, fell, ate crap, and butt stroked yourself with your own rifle, hit that subscribe button as well. Like, comment, do all the good things. I have a line of shirts and belts out. If you're interested, check out the video. If you like what you see, buy them. That money supports my channel directly. We're going to be doing a lot of good things with Alonzo Defense Group, who is making the shirts and the belts. So, with those things out of the way, let's talk about it. AIMPOINT versus EOTech. I made that video about 4 months ago, and when I made that video, people said, hey, Garand, you're being kind of an asshole. You didn't consider all the points on the EOTech. And I reviewed their comments, I looked at what they had to say, and I realized that, indeed, I was biased when I made that review. But my comments are up there. I'm not going to remove them just because I was wrong, because I can be wrong. So I wanted to make another video talking about EOTech and why I think that it's probably one of the best choices for a carbine optic. Now, this might be surprising to some of you. Now, before we get into that, contacted EOTech. They sent me an EOTech EXPS 3-0. That's the one I did my review on, along with a couple other goodies that we'll be reviewing in the future. Now, if you're familiar with EOTech, you know that they went through kind of a huge PR nightmare. And that's due to the fact that EOTech was found to have been suffering from a whole host of issues, whether it be moisture incursion, delamination of the window, and thermal drift. The big issue for a lot of people is thermal drift. So what is thermal drift? Well, when the optic got too hot or too cold, we're not going to go specific numbers, the reticle would shift a certain amount so that your zero would no longer be true. Now, that was typically between around 3 to 5 MOA. That's significant. That's about 3 to 5 inches off at 100 yards. So the question is what has changed? Well, when that all went down, L3, who is the parent company for EOTech, they make the PEG-15, image intensifiers for unfilmed white phosphor, lots of good stuff. They brought all their engineers in and they fixed EOTech because there was obviously an issue there. So they got rid of the moisture incursion issue, the delamination issue, and the thermal drift issue. Now the thermal drift for the EOTech is in line with what you see from other optics, around 1.5 to 2 or somewhere around there. And my own independent testing with about 4 optics made post-2016, we had about an average of about 1.5, which is about what you typically see. So you see thermal drift in all optics, and the EOTech is among the best when it comes to the thermal drift. Probably only beaten out by the AIMPOINT T2, which in internal studies that I've seen, circulating through the DoD, I've seen that it has very, very little. So with those things in mind, let's take a look at the EOTech and let's figure out why we might choose it. So one reason that I like the EOTech so much is the reticle. The reticle is a donut of death, and I love it. It's a 1 MOA dot in the center with a 65 MOA ring around it. It looks like a World War II gun sight on a fighter, and as we know, World War II fighters are super cool, therefore EOTech is, by definition, cool. The 1 MOA dot, very easy, very precise. You can use it out to distance. The 65 MOA ring, when you're engaging targets within 50 meters, typically that torso fits in that 65 MOA ring, makes shooting at close range very easy, very intuitive. Now I was talking with Lucas of T-Rex Arms here, who I respect a lot, and his thoughts on it were that it doesn't matter much. It's a training issue, and he believes that training is the biggest thing, and I definitely agree with him. But I do want to point this out. I think that having the advantage of a reticle that makes shooting in a dynamic, changing, fluctuating environment a little bit easier could be of benefit. So if you're a guy where battery life isn't so big, but perhaps getting those shots as quick as possible in a confined, chaotic environment might be, that EOTech reticle is money. Another thing is parallax shift. Let's do this. Parallax shift. This is a huge thing that not a lot of people know about, and it's one of the reasons I'm a huge fan of EOTech optics. What is parallax shift? Well, if I am on my gun and I am not directly lined up with that reticle, then there's going to be some shift of that reticle on the target. It's common with any optic. Now the question is when would I encounter parallax shift? Well, when you're shooting around cars, around corners, any type of unorthodox shooting position. Are you going to see it so much shooting off a bench? No, but you're going to see it a lot more as you get into dynamic environments. So, parallax shift. Green Eye Tactical came out with a study around 2 months ago. And in it, they took every modern optic, they lined them up, and they checked to see what their parallax error was at 25, 50, and 100 yards. Results are surprising. The EOTech had a parallax error at 25 yards of 1.5 MOA. Significant to be sure, but not that bad. The AIMPOINT T1 had a shift of 12.4 MOA. That's enormous. That's huge. That's 12 inches at 100 yards. The Trijicon MRO had a shift of 15.25 MOA at 25 yards. Now you might say to yourself, but this is really close. We know that the closer it is, the worse the parallax should be. But that's not the case. At 50 yards, the EOTech had a 0.8 MOA shift. The AIMPOINT T1 had a 9.5 MOA shift, and the Trijicon MRO had a 11.4 MOA shift. That's incredibly significant. Going down to 100 yards, the AIMPOINT T1 had a shift of 9.7, and the MRO had a shift of 12.9, and the EOTech had a shift of 0 MOA. And that was for a EXPS 3-0 and an EXPS 3-2 optic. Those numbers mean a lot. That means if I'm not directly behind that optic, lined up perfectly, that my shot could possibly be off. And that is a huge issue for me. Now, I want it to be known that the AIMPOINT T2 did very well. The AIMPOINT T2 had about a shift of around 2.5 to 3 through all those various iterations. That's still significant though. I would rather have a lower parallax shift. What's even more interesting about the parallax shift is that there's so little window on the Trijicon MRO and on the AIMPOINT T1 that you'd think you'd have less. So there's things going on there because the EOTech has a 30% larger window with less shift. And that comes into play with the technology going behind it. Holographic technology just works a little bit better when it comes to that parallax shift. So, superior parallax shift, the EOTech kills it, and it's one reason that I'm a huge fan of it. All right, we've talked about that. Let's talk about controls. Big fan of the controls. To zero the optic, you have these recessed elevation and windage knobs. Easy to change, they can't be bumped and switched, there's no caps to screw off. Easy to use, I like them. Controls, press the down button, auto on for 4 hours, and it will shut off at 4 hours. Hit the up arrow, turns on for 8 hours, and then it will shut off. Now to reset it, just hit one of those buttons again, and it'll reset it for 4 or 8. So when I'm on patrols doing that type of thing, just hit it every time you stop or check your map or something like that. Night vision settings right there, we'll talk about that in a second. Good controls. It's also a very rugged optic. It's been tested, been through a lot. Sure, I know somebody will be out there and will be like, well, Lance Corporal so-and-so had his EOTech fail, or Corporal so-and-so or Sergeant so-and-so will say their optic failed. And yes, absolutely. But by and far, the EOTech is probably one of the more proven optics that you see out there in the world today, and I would definitely bet my life on it. Great optic. Magnification. The EOTech, due to its holographic weapon sight technology, when it's magnified, the 1 MOA dot stays 1 MOA. That is not true of other optics, such as the AIMPOINTs or the Trijicon MROs, where the dot is enlarged under magnification. How big of a deal is that for you? Maybe not that big of a deal, but if you're a guy who runs a magnifier, it's definitely something to think about. Finally, the window. The window on the EOTech is large and open. There's no tint, there's edge-to-edge clarity. Compare that to the Trijicon MRO that has a very noticeable blue tint, or the AIMPOINT T1, which even has a tint. Now the T2 is actually pretty clear in comparison, but it should be noted that the EOTech has that very clear open window. Now, people will say with that window, does it really matter? Because with the AIMPOINTs, I'm just focusing past the window onto the target. So is it really that big of a deal? And it is training to some extent, but again, having that bigger window on a relative threat area that I'm looking at will just help me better with my situational awareness. So I found that I do like that big open window in the EOTech quite a bit. Night vision use. So few people talk about this, but if you are one of those guys where you use your optic with night vision, now there's a whole lot of things going into it, whether you use illuminator or a IR laser versus an optic, we're not going to talk too much about that. But I found that the EOTech is superior to almost every other optic when it comes to night vision use. And the reason for that is because the window is open, there's a lot of light transmission, therefore a lot of that light reaches my image intensifiers on my night vision goggles. Compare that to the AIMPOINT where it's that small tube and you have a little bit of a problem. On top of that, with the Trijicon MRO, the T1, not so much the T2, still a little bit, you get a little bit of smearing on that dot when I'm looking through it through night vision. So the EOTech reticle, incredibly clean when looking through it with night vision. Big fan of it. I'm not going to say too much more on that, other than the EOTech has been depicted in a lot of films under night vision, and who better to represent it than Michael Bay in 13 Hours.
Left, by the screen!
Michael Bay.
That's an aimpoint right.
All right, we've talked about a lot of the pros of the EOTech. Let's talk about some of the cons of the EOTech. So, it is big, right? It is much larger than the AIMPOINT T2 and the T1 and the MRO, pretty much any optic out there that you see as far as the miniaturized versions are concerned. Another thing is weight. It is double the weight of any miniaturized optic. Another big concern for a lot of people is battery life. So let's talk about battery life for a moment. The EXPS 3.0 has approximately 600 hours of battery life. Compare that to the battery life of the AIMPOINT T2, which is around 50,000 in a medium setting. There's not that much of a comparison. What it really comes down to is, what are you looking for? Do you want an optic that's always on? You can live with a little bit of parallax there. The AIMPOINT T2 is a really good choice. However, if you're looking for unparalleled speed with the reticle and just edge-to-edge clarity, clear window, and that type of stuff, the EOTech is probably your go-to. As long as you have a good supply line with batteries, the EOTech is going to be your go-to optic. I found that typically with my shooting schedule, which is pretty often, usually about every other day, I can usually go about 3 or 4 months on one battery. Find what works for you. And remember, the thing that really matters when it comes to these optics is looking cool. And the EOTech is undeniably the coolest looking optic out there. So, case closed.